Charleston, South Carolina. March 14, 1850. A group of the most distinguished scientific minds in America gathered in a private study on Meeting Street. Physicians, mathematicians, professors from the nation's oldest universities. Men who had spent their entire lives measuring, categorizing, and explaining the natural world. They came with their instruments, their theories, their absolute certainty about how the human mind works, about what was possible, and, more importantly to them, what was impossible. For 3 hours that night, they conducted tests, experiments, observations. They took measurements. They asked questions designed to expose deception, to reveal tricks, to confirm what they already believed they knew about the limits of human capability. And when it was over, not one of them could explain what they had witnessed. The subject of their examination was a boy, 11 years old, born into bondage on a rice plantation 40 miles from the city. A child who, by every law and custom of that time and place, was considered property. 3/5 of a person in the eyes of the Constitution. Denied education by statute. Forbidden to read. Forbidden to write. Yet this boy could solve complex mathematical equations in his head faster than trained mathematicians could work them on paper. He could memorize and recite entire conversations word for word after hearing them once. He could learn languages with a speed that defied explanation. He could read Latin texts after 3 days of exposure to the language. One of the professors that night, a man named Dr. Edmund Haversham, wrote in his private journal, "I have examined this child with every scientific instrument at my disposal. I have tested him with problems that would challenge my colleagues at Harvard. And I am forced to conclude that I cannot account for what I have observed. Either everything I have been taught about the nature of intelligence is incomplete, or I am witnessing something that exists outside the boundaries of natural philosophy." 3 weeks later, Dr. Haversham withdrew from public life. He never published his findings. The other scientists who attended that meeting, most of them never spoke publicly about what they saw. Their notes, their measurements, their carefully recorded observations, scattered, hidden, lost to history. But whispers spread. Through academic circles. Through drawing rooms and medical societies. Stories of a slave child whose mind challenged everything they thought they understood. A mind that, according to the science of that era, should not exist. What happened in that room in Charleston? What did those men see that disturbed them so profoundly they chose silence over scientific inquiry? And what became of the boy whose abilities they could not explain? If this story has captured your attention, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories of forgotten history that challenge everything we thought we knew. Share this documentary with anyone who needs to hear this remarkable tale. Now, let's continue with the full story of Thomas. To understand this story, we must first understand the world that shaped it. The American South in 1850 was a society built on a foundation of forced labor and rigid hierarchy. 4 million people lived in bondage. An entire economy depended on denying their humanity. And supporting this system was a structure of laws, customs, and, crucially, science. Or what passed for science in that age. The leading minds of the era had constructed elaborate theories to justify slavery. They measured skulls. They compared brain weights. They published papers in prestigious journals claiming to prove, through careful observation and data, that certain races were intellectually inferior by nature. Fixed. Unchangeable. Scientific fact. What's critical to understand about 1850s America is that racial hierarchy wasn't just defended by law or religion. It was defended by science. The most educated people, doctors, university professors, natural philosophers, they genuinely believed they had measured and proven fundamental differences in human capacity. In this world, the education of enslaved people was not merely discouraged. It was criminal. South Carolina law explicitly forbade teaching slaves to read or write. The penalty, 100 lashes and a 50-pound fine. The reason was simple. Knowledge was dangerous. An educated slave might question, might resist, might prove capable of things that would undermine the entire philosophical justification for their enslavement. On the Whitmore plantation, 40 miles west of Charleston, a boy was born in the winter of 1839. The ledger listed him as property acquired through birth. His mother, listed as Patience, age 23, house servant. His father, unknown or unrecorded. The boy was not given a surname. In the records he appears simply as Thomas. No birthday. No baptism. Just an entry marking his existence as an asset. We actually know very little about Thomas's early years. What we do know comes from later accounts, from testimony given years after the fact. But what becomes clear is that by age 7 or 8, people around him began to notice something unusual. The first recorded mention comes from an overseer's report dated October 1847. The overseer, a man named Patterson, wrote to the plantation owner about an incident in the stables. The boy Thomas repeated back to me a conversation I had with the blacksmith 3 days prior. Word for word. Including details I had myself forgotten. When questioned, he also recited conversations between other workers, some in their native languages, though he has no schooling in those tongues. The field hands are calling it unnatural. It's causing disruption. Unnatural. That word appears again and again in the scattered documents that survive. Not brilliant. Not gifted. Unnatural. What they were describing sounds consistent with what we now call hyperthymesia, highly superior autobiographical memory, combined with potentially eidetic or near-eidetic capabilities. But in 1847, they had no framework for understanding this. They only knew it didn't fit their expectations. For months, Thomas's abilities remained confined to the plantation. Whispered about. Feared by some. Dismissed by others as exaggeration. Then, in January 1849, everything changed. A guest arrived at Whitmore Plantation. A mathematician from Charleston named Samuel Prentice, visiting on business with the plantation owner. At dinner, Prentice happened to mention a calculation problem he'd been working on. A complex equation involving compound interest and agricultural yield projections. According to Prentice's own account, written 3 days later, the boy Thomas, who was serving at the table, spoke up. He gave the answer. The complete solution to a problem that had taken Prentice 2 days to work through with pen and paper. The boy solved it in his head in less than a minute. Prentice was astonished. Then suspicious. He gave the boy more problems. Progressively more difficult. Mathematical challenges that would test a university student. Thomas answered each one correctly. The mathematician returned to Charleston and did something unusual. He talked. He told colleagues. He wrote letters. And word spread through the city's academic community about a slave child who could perform mathematical calculations that seemed impossible. You have to understand, this was deeply threatening. The entire scientific establishment had built careers on proving intellectual hierarchy. And here was a child, denied every educational advantage, demonstrating capabilities that exceeded their own in certain domains. Some dismissed it as impossible. Others called it fraud. But enough were curious that a proposal was made. Bring the boy to Charleston. Test him under controlled conditions. Prove or disprove these extraordinary claims. The plantation owner, a man named Robert Whitmore, saw an opportunity. Not for science. For profit. If the boy truly possessed these abilities, he could be exhibited. Shown to paying audiences. Leased out to scholars who would pay for access to such a curiosity. In February 1850, Thomas was brought to Charleston for the first time in his life. He was 11 years old. He had never been educated formally. Had never attended school. Had never been taught to read by any teacher. Yet within weeks of arriving in the city, something became apparent. Thomas had taught himself to read. How, no one could determine. He had somehow learned by observing, by listening, by piecing together fragments of knowledge he'd gathered over years of silent observation. When presented with newspapers, he could read them fluently. When given books, he absorbed them at extraordinary speed. One account describes him reading a 200-page volume in an evening and being able to recite passages from it days later. Not just the general meaning, but the exact words. The punctuation. The structure of sentences. His memory was not just exceptional. It was absolute. The demonstrations began in small settings. Private homes. Drawing rooms of wealthy families. Thomas would be brought in, and guests would test him. They gave him mathematical problems. He solved them instantly. They spoke to him in French. He responded in French, despite having no formal instruction in the language. They read him poetry once. He recited it back perfectly. They played musical compositions. He reproduced them on the piano, note for note, having never been taught music. Each demonstration raised more questions than it answered. How was this possible? Where did this capacity come from? And most troubling to the scientific minds of that era, if one slave child could possess such abilities, what did that mean for their theories about racial intelligence? The implications were too dangerous to contemplate. If Thomas could be this brilliant despite every disadvantage, despite being denied education, despite living in bondage, then perhaps intelligence was not distributed the way they had convinced themselves it was. Perhaps their measurements, their skull studies, their elaborate theories were all built on a false foundation. This is where the story becomes darker. Because Thomas was not free. He was property. And his owner controlled every aspect of his existence. Robert Whitmore began to exhibit Thomas more publicly. For money. Scientists paid to examine him. Wealthy families paid to see him perform. Thomas became a spectacle. A curiosity. An anomaly to be studied and displayed. But here's what makes this story truly haunting. The more people saw Thomas, the more threatened they became. Not by him, but by what he represented. Letters from that period reveal a deep anxiety among Charleston's educated elite. If this boy could do what he did, what else might be possible? What other assumptions might be wrong? The foundation of their entire society rested on the premise of inherent difference. Thomas shook that foundation simply by existing. In March 1850, that gathering of scientists took place. The one we spoke of at the beginning. It was meant to be definitive. A thorough examination that would either expose Thomas as a fraud or explain his abilities in terms consistent with existing scientific understanding. 9 men attended. All of them respected in their fields. All of them committed to the scientific method. They tested Thomas for 3 hours. The records of what exactly they did are incomplete, but fragments survive. They gave him complex mathematical problems that would challenge trained mathematicians. He solved them faster than they could verify his answers. They read him passages in Latin and Greek. He translated them, despite having minimal exposure to classical languages. They showed him geometric proofs. He identified errors in their logic. One test involved memory. They read him a list of 50 random words. Once. He repeated them back in order. Then backwards. Then he recited only the words that started with certain letters. Then he arranged them alphabetically in his head and recited them in that order. The scientists were methodical. They looked for tricks. For patterns that might explain his performance as memorization techniques or mathematical shortcuts. They examined him physically, measuring his head, his features, looking for anatomical explanations. They questioned him about his methods. "How do you do it?" they asked. Thomas reportedly said he didn't know. He just could. The numbers appeared in his mind. The words stayed with him. Languages made sense after he heard them enough times. Dr. Haversham, the most senior scientist present, attempted to apply the theories of his time. He measured Thomas's skull using calipers, comparing the dimensions to charts that claimed to predict intelligence. The measurements didn't match the predictions. They didn't fit the categories. Thomas's cranial dimensions were entirely ordinary, yet his performance was extraordinary. This was the paradox that science of that era could not resolve. At the end of 3 hours, the scientists conferred. Their conclusion, as recorded in Haversham's private journal, was remarkable in its honesty and its limitations. They could not explain what they had observed. They could not identify fraud. They could not find tricks. They could not reconcile Thomas's abilities with their understanding of human cognition. One of them suggested that Thomas might represent some rare variation in human capability, a statistical outlier that appeared occasionally across all populations. But that explanation was too dangerous to publish. It would imply that intelligence was not racially determined, that exceptional minds could emerge anywhere, under any circumstances. So they did nothing. No paper was published. No findings were announced. The meeting was quietly forgotten. Most of the men who attended went back to their universities and their practices and never spoke of it again. Dr. Haversham's withdrawal from public life 3 weeks later suggests how deeply the experience troubled him. Here was a man who had built his career on certain assumptions about human nature, and a child had demolished those assumptions in a single evening. But Thomas's story didn't end there. For the next several years, he continued to be exhibited throughout the South. His owner profited considerably from these displays. Thomas was shown in Richmond, in Atlanta, in New Orleans. Everywhere he went, he amazed audiences. And everywhere he went, the same pattern repeated. Initial wonder, followed by discomfort, followed by silence. People saw what he could do, but they couldn't integrate it into their worldview, so they chose not to think about it. Contemporary accounts describe Thomas as quiet, withdrawn, rarely showing emotion during these exhibitions. One observer noted that he seemed to be somewhere else in his mind, even while performing these remarkable feats. Another described his eyes as sad beyond his years. We have to remember that while scientists debated his abilities, Thomas himself was a child. A child separated from his mother. A child owned by another human being. A child whose gifts brought him not freedom or opportunity, but more constraint. More scrutiny. More exploitation. In 1854, something shifted. Thomas was now 15 years old. The exhibitions had become less frequent. Perhaps the novelty had worn off. Perhaps the discomfort his presence caused had finally outweighed the profit. The historical record becomes sparse here. We lose track of Thomas for several years. Some historians believe he was sold to a different owner. Others suggest he may have been sent back to plantation labor. One unverified account claims he tried to escape and was recaptured. We simply don't know with certainty. What we do know is that in 1861, when the Civil War began, Thomas would have been 22 years old. Somewhere in the chaos of that war, in the collapse of the Confederacy and the end of slavery, Thomas disappears from the record entirely. We don't know if he survived the war. We don't know if he gained his freedom. We don't know if he lived to see emancipation or if he died before that day came. His story, which began with such extraordinary documentation, ends in silence. This is perhaps the cruelest part of Thomas's tale. We know what he could do. We have records of his remarkable mind. But we don't know who he became. We don't know if he ever had the chance to use his gifts freely. We don't know if he found happiness or peace or fulfillment. History preserved him as a curiosity but not as a person. Modern neuroscience and psychology give us frameworks to understand what Thomas might have experienced. Hyperthymesia, the condition of highly superior autobiographical memory, affects perhaps fewer than 100 people worldwide that we know of. People with this condition can remember virtually every day of their lives in extraordinary detail. Combined with what appears to have been exceptional computational ability and possibly eidetic memory, Thomas's cognitive profile would be extremely rare even today. But rarity is not the same as impossibility. Thomas was not supernatural. He was not magic. He was a human being with an exceptional brain, born into a society that could not accept what his existence meant. The scientists who examined him weren't wrong to be astonished. They were wrong to think that astonishment gave them the right to own him, display him, or reduce him to a curiosity. They were wrong to let their theories about race prevent them from seeing the obvious truth, that intelligence is a human trait, distributed without regard to the artificial categories we create. Thomas's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How many other minds like his existed in bondage and were never recognized? How many children with extraordinary potential were never allowed to develop their gifts because of the circumstances of their birth? How much human brilliance was suppressed, denied, destroyed by systems of oppression? We often think of genius as something that inevitably reveals itself, that talent always finds a way. Thomas's story suggests otherwise. Talent needs opportunity. It needs freedom. It needs society to be willing to see it. Thomas had extraordinary abilities, but he didn't have freedom. He didn't have choice. He didn't have the chance to decide what to do with his gifts. Others decided for him. They decided he would be exhibited. They decided he would be tested. They decided when and where and how he would demonstrate his abilities. And ultimately, they decided he wasn't worth remembering as a full human being. The scientific establishment of the 1850s failed Thomas. They had the tools of observation, of measurement, of documentation. They could have used his case to challenge their assumptions, to revise their theories, to acknowledge the complexity of human intelligence. Instead, they chose comfort over truth. They chose to protect their worldview rather than expand it. They chose silence over science. This pattern didn't end with Thomas. Throughout American history, black excellence has been simultaneously recognized and dismissed. Acknowledged and then explained away. Celebrated in private and ignored in public. Thomas is part of a long line of individuals whose achievements were too threatening to the status quo to be fully embraced. Too powerful to be denied entirely, but too dangerous to the existing order to be celebrated. What would Thomas think if he could see the world today? Would he be encouraged by the progress we've made? Would he be disappointed by how far we still have to go? Would he recognize the ways that talent is still constrained by circumstance, how opportunity is still distributed unequally, how brilliance is still sometimes dismissed because it appears in unexpected places? We can't answer these questions. Thomas is gone. But his story remains. Not as a curiosity. Not as an anomaly. But as a reminder. A reminder that human potential exceeds our categories. That intelligence cannot be constrained by artificial boundaries. That extraordinary minds can emerge anywhere. And that our failure to recognize and nurture that potential is our loss, not theirs. The documents that survive about Thomas are scattered across various archives. A letter here. A journal entry there. Newspaper mentions. Account books. Fragments of a life that should have been documented fully but was instead half forgotten. Researchers today are still piecing together his story, still trying to understand the full scope of who he was and what he experienced. Every new document that surfaces adds another piece to the puzzle. But the center of that puzzle, Thomas himself, his inner life, his thoughts, his feelings about being treated as an exhibit rather than a person, that remains largely unknown. One of the few quotes we have directly attributed to Thomas comes from an 1852 exhibition in Richmond. Someone in the audience asked him if he enjoyed demonstrating his abilities. According to the account, Thomas was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I do what I'm told to do." 5 words. But they contain volumes about his experience. Not joy. Not pride. Just compliance. Obedience. The response of someone who understood he had no choice in the matter. This is what makes Thomas's story not just remarkable but tragic. His gifts didn't bring him freedom. They brought him more chains. Different chains, perhaps. The chains of being exhibited rather than being worked in fields. But chains nonetheless. He was still property. Still denied autonomy. Still trapped in a system that saw him as less than human despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The scientists who examined Thomas in 1850 were looking for an explanation that would allow them to maintain their beliefs about racial hierarchy. They wanted to find something that would let them say, "Yes, this child is remarkable, but he's an exception that proves the rule." They wanted to categorize him in a way that wouldn't threaten their worldview. And when they couldn't do that, when Thomas's abilities couldn't be neatly explained or dismissed, they simply chose not to talk about it. That silence is its own kind of verdict. It reveals more about them than it does about Thomas. Consider what it means that the scientists conducted their examination but published nothing. In the normal course of scientific inquiry, an anomaly is exciting. It's an opportunity to learn something new, to expand understanding. But this anomaly was too costly. Acknowledging what Thomas's abilities meant would have required acknowledging that their entire framework for understanding human difference was flawed. It would have required questioning not just their science but the social system that science was being used to justify. That was too high a price. So they remained silent, and Thomas remained in bondage. This silence extended beyond those individual scientists. The broader academic community of that era, despite being aware of Thomas through the rumors and stories that circulated, never seriously investigated his case. There was no follow-up study. No attempt at longitudinal research. No effort to understand the development of his abilities over time. Thomas represented a natural experiment, a case study that could have advanced understanding of human cognition significantly. But that understanding would have come with uncomfortable implications, so it was avoided. The pattern here is important because it didn't begin with Thomas and it didn't end with him. Throughout history, evidence that challenges dominant narratives about human difference has often been ignored, suppressed, or explained away. Thomas is one example among many of people whose existence complicated the stories societies told themselves about who was capable of what. And in almost every case, society chose to discount the evidence rather than revise the story. What gives Thomas's case particular power is how well documented it was, at least initially. These weren't vague rumors or exaggerated tales. Multiple credible witnesses, including trained scientists, observed and recorded his abilities. The documentation exists. Yet despite that documentation, Thomas was forgotten. His story was allowed to fade. That forgetting was not accidental. It was convenient. It was comfortable. It allowed people to continue believing what they wanted to believe. Recovering Thomas's story now, more than 170 years later, is an act of historical correction. It's a way of saying that the silence was wrong. That Thomas deserved better. That his story deserves to be known not as a curiosity but as part of the larger story of American history. Part of the story of slavery and its aftermath. Part of the story of how science has been used and misused. Part of the story of human potential and how it has been recognized or denied based on factors that have nothing to do with ability. If you've stayed with us through this entire journey, you now know a story that was nearly lost to history. A story about genius denied, potential suppressed, and a society that chose comfort over truth. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it challenged something you believed, then please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share Thomas's story with others. Leave a comment below telling us your thoughts. What questions does this raise for you? What other forgotten stories need to be told? And most importantly, how do we ensure that today's exceptional minds, regardless of where they come from or what they look like, are given the opportunities that Thomas was denied? The conversation continues with you. Thank you for watching.